So which armies are you guys least happy to see on the other side of the tabletop? Let's talk through the specific Warhammer 40k factions that seem to be least popular to play in-game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd answer a question that had been on my mind for a while, and try and find out which Warhammer 40k armies are least popular to play in-game, and the reasons that people don't like facing them. I'll start out with a couple of important caveats though. While it does certainly seem to be true that people generally tend to prefer playing against some certain factions compared with others, I feel like the faction choice that you play is so much less important than the actual person that's playing the army. Games of Warhammer 40k basically are a social interaction, and if you're playing someone who's super fun, very polite, and just nice to have a game with, then it's not really going to matter exactly what flavour of model soldiers they're putting on the other side of the table. The same is definitely true the other way around as well. If someone's cheating a lot and just generally being unpleasant, playing one of the popular factions isn't going to save the game and make it into a good experience. I also think it's fairly important with topics like this to be clear that we're not really trying to encourage any sort of faction hate between different sort of factions in 40k. I think you can definitely have a fair bit of friendly banter and try and rib people about the factions that they're playing and the things that they do in lore or in game. But I feel like if you go a bit too far with it, you probably reach a bit of a tipping point where you genuinely demoralise the people who are collecting those factions. Most seasoned veterans aren't exactly going to care too much and can take a bit of ribbing, but if you're just getting into Warhammer 40k for the first time and it makes you feel like you've made the wrong choice of army because people don't like playing against you, I'd say that's definitely going too far. This whole video is definitely supposed to be just seeing a few popular opinions and what people enjoy in playing a game and what they don't, as opposed to trying to call out any armies in particular. The whole list will probably change a fair bit as well in 10th edition, with game mechanics and power levels moving on. In any case, to try and answer the question of which are the least popular factions to play in Warhammer 40k, I decided to do a recent poll on the channel. I asked you to rate each army in terms of enjoyment to play against, give them a score out of 5, and then to tell me why a few of the lowest voted armies are less enjoyable, at least in your own eyes. At some point I'll try and follow up this video with one with the most popular armies, but we're going to focus on the bottom of the field today. I have covered this in previous videos on the channel, but I feel like there's a fair few factors that make an army less popular to fight against, mainly broadly boiling down to these 4 reasons. First up, if game balance isn't good and factions that are just too strong are generally not going to be the most popular to play against, it's definitely going to hamper the enjoyment a bit if you don't feel like things are fair on the other side of the tabletop. The amount of armies that you might see in a meta can influence things as well. Things that are very, very overplayed and you run into far too regularly can be a bit depressing, particularly if they also seem to be very strong as well. I feel like that was certainly the case for Space Marines during late 8th edition, having a ridiculously strong codex and also being an army that loads of people collect that they hadn't got to play competitively in a while. Then there's all the armies that kind of lack engagement in one way or another, skew lists perhaps being one example of that. Say if you're spamming a massive horde of all the same defensive profile, or the same for elite infantry or heavy vehicle lists, it just reduces the interaction and the opportunity that your opponent has to play the units how they'd like to. They basically just have to try and kill the defensive profile, and the game can maybe feel like a bit more of a slog. Otherwise, for lack of engagement, things that have massive amount of movement tricks, shenanigans, or raw speed will often stop you from getting the first strike, or might stop you from striking back. Again, can be frustrating to play against if your units can't catch up with them. Maybe very heavy use of things like flyers or artillery aren't particularly great either. Again, not really things that you can do very much about sometimes. And in general, in these sort of popularity contests, things that have fully ranged forces tend to be a bit less popular than things that mix range and melee, or are all melee. It means that if you are playing an army with some combat units, it feels like a bit less of a game of keep away from them, and the opponent might be giving and taking blows. Finally, and perhaps a little bit less relevant to comparing different factions, are armies that might break the lore a bit, or have little or no modelling or painting effort put into them. Definitely not the end of the world, but might not add to the overall playing experience. I feel like that's going to be more for individual players than factions in general. Broadly speaking though, I'd say that they're the main reasons that people might not enjoy playing a force quite as much, so let's put that together and look at what you guys voted at the bottom third or so of armies in Warhammer 40k. So first up in this list, and voted around about 8th least popular, are the Thousand Sons, that have combined a couple of armies as we go down. The Sons of Magnus were voted 3.1 out of 5 by you guys, though I'd certainly bear in mind that these aren't really all that low down the list. 40k has only really got around about 20 to 26 factions, kind of depends on where you count them, and these are definitely a bit more lower midfield as opposed to being towards the bottom. For the most part on these lower voted armies, I feel like army win rate doesn't track enormously well. It doesn't seem like people are just voting for the things that are strongest right now in game, though maybe there are a few things that are a bit more notable for that. The Thousand Sons certainly aren't particularly strong in game at the moment, around about a 43% win rate, one of the weakest armies in 40k currently. I feel like the reasons that people might be a little bit apprehensive about playing against these guys is just all the psychic shenanigans. Maybe in a similar sort of way as some armies that spam one sort of defensive profile, people perhaps aren't super keen on fighting nothing but psychic, perhaps particularly not if you're playing a faction that doesn't really have any sort of psychic defense, or mortal wounds are particularly punishing against. Having loads of those flying at you does feel like it's something that's kinda hard to counter. I feel that they're quite a complicated army to understand as well, and you might just be sat on the other side of the table just not really quite understanding what's going on with all the Thousand Sons psychic powers going off. They do have really quite a lot of options, with every single squad having a Psyker in it, plus the actual characters. And then even if you understand all the base spells, you've still got a few other layers of other things that you can access, things like those Kabbalistic rituals and a bunch of stratagems and things like swapping out powers. Might just feel like a psychic phase of just watching the other player roll dice and not really knowing what's going on all that much. Otherwise, I guess maybe the battle line units can be a little bit on the samey side, generally tending to be tons of Rubik Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators backed up by the Psychers. To be fair to them, that might be more Games Workshop's fault than anyone else. It's not like they have the most enormous model range, having far less than, say, Death Guard. In any case though, I certainly would stress that Thousand Sons really aren't all that far down, but I can see why they could frustrate some people. At a similar kind of level here were both Craftworlds and Drukhari, both on very similar scores. Again, these were rated 3.1 out of 5, kind of similar to the Thousand Sons, hardly the most unpopular factions to face. Currently in game, both of them are kind of mid-tierish, Craftworlds at around about 50% wins and Drukhari a bit worse at around 46. Neither of them exactly OP in any way. I do kind of wonder though if at least part of contributing to this might be the power level that these two have enjoyed over a fair bit of 9th edition and before. Certainly Drukhari were absolutely dominating the tournament scene for a pretty extended period until Games Workshop finally got a handle on them. And in general, I feel like the understanding of the average player does trail a bit behind the absolute current bleeding edge of tournament data. There might be a fair few people who last played Drukhari when they were completely strong and over the top, even if they're actually not super powerful right now. I guess Craftworlds definitely had their time in the sun, releasing at the same time as the Harlequins in that Eldari Codex. They were definitely on the upper tier of factions. In general, the reputation of Eldar does tend to be fairly fast, strong damage output, and loads of shenanigans to tip the fight in their favour. That is kind of all very lore appropriate to be honest, but can sometimes make them a bit frustrating to fight potentially. They've got pretty massive movement speed, and Drukhari could be charging you halfway across the board in a single turn. And then the Craftworlds have an absolute ton of ways to strike and then hide again, things like swooping hawks jumping on and off the board, battle focus, moving in and behind terrain, their fire and fade stratagem, and things like D-cannons giving you a bit of quality ignores line of sight. I feel like when you get armies that are just very heavily reliant on things like shenanigans to win, can often lead to players feeling like their army should be more effective against the enemy than they are. And it's perhaps only obscure reasons that are keeping them from being able to deal damage to them, and maybe just give them a bit less agency in game perhaps. Still though, certainly in army power levels at the moment, they seem to be pretty well balanced. Their defensive profiles when you do catch up to them can be fairly weak, and Craftworlds in particular don't enjoy ignores line of sight firepower, ideally getting the first strike on them. Next up, and also on very similar scores, are the Imperial and Chaos Knights. These were both rated at 3 out of 5, so a little bit below the Eldar. Again, I feel like these guys perhaps have more similarities than differences in terms of playing against experience. Out of these two, the Imperials were perhaps rated very slightly lower than the Chaos. I feel like that might perhaps be due to a bit more range damage focus maybe. Plus the Chaos Knights get a few fun things like their dread abilities and demonic favours, perhaps mechanics that are a little bit more interesting to play against than the Imperial versions. Currently in power level, Chaos Knights are doing a little bit better than the Imperials, around about 47% win percent on average, around about mid-tier for 40k at the moment, maybe a tiny bit on the lower side of things. In general, I'd say that Knights are kind of by their nature just a massive skew list. Unlike other factions, they don't really have all that much opportunity to play any way differently, as every single unit's going to be a big fighty and damaging vehicle. A bunch of them super heavies, but even the War Dogs are going to be quite different to play against compared with infantry. I'd say in their latest codexes, the Knight books tend to be a lot more engaging and interesting to fight against than they have been in the past, but I'd say that it feels like playing a game of Warhammer 40k of a very different kind of nature, and maybe something that just not everyone's always in the mood for. They can often have some armies that they win big against or lose big against as well, If you brought loads of anti-tank, you're probably a shoo-in. If you didn't bring enough, then it's going to be a very, very hard game or impossible to beat them. And while they do hit some factions very hard, they do have some very hard counters of their own, like say Guard, Votann or Demons, or armies that they can struggle against quite a lot. In general, it does mean that a whole load of enemy infantry units just might not be able to do what they'd normally like to. Anything that's built for skirmishing with light infantry is going to be kind of rubbish. And in terms of spam lists, I'd say perhaps some of the worst offenders are things like pure War Dog lists for Chaos Knights. That's about as spammy as you can get, only really taking one unit profile, the only major change being the guns that they can be armed with. Otherwise, besides just their nature of being a skewed vehicle list, they do have a whole load of raw power. It can make them tough to handle in more casual games where you're just taking a fair amount of basic troops, and it can make them kind of hard to play against for certain armies at lower points level. Combat Patrol Knights with just armigers are fairly rough in terms of the damage and defense that they bring. Finally, a comment that I see a fair bit on Imperial Knight type content on the channel over the last few years is that some people just don't really enjoy the aesthetic within Warhammer 40k and just feel that they're kind of built for a bigger sort of game like Apocalypse or really big stylistic games, as opposed to just being a faction that you can play with any army whatsoever and expect to have the same experience. I don't think that that's absolutely super massively common, but there's definitely a few people out there who feel that way. In general, though, I do think that Games Workshop executed the Chaos Knights and Imperial Knight codexes really quite well in 9th edition. They're certainly a lot more interactive and interesting than they have been in the past, able to play the objective game but not dominating it, and having some actual synergies between the units so board position matters a bit more rather than just stomping the way through your opponent's army. Moving onwards though, and voted in 5th least popular place were the Adeptus Custodes, these guys being scored 2.9 out of 5 by you guys. It seems that people aren't quite such big fans of seeing the Golden Boys on the other side of the table, at least at time of recording. Currently the Custodes are one of the stronger armies in Warhammer 40k, 53% wins and pretty powerful. I feel like the Custodes might well be falling foul of being both very popular and also very strong both at the same time, so people are getting a bit tired of playing them. On the popularity side, they've been super easy to jump into for 40k for a while now, but in particular I think a lot of people jumped on the Christmas Battle Force box, which was basically most of the 40k army in one set. Like Imperial Knights as well, the barrier to entry in terms of models that you need to paint is kind of low. That makes them easy to put on the table, and when they get strong they do get very popular. They're currently the most commonly played competitive faction in Arcs of Omen. Lots and lots of people putting the Emperor's Golden Guardians on the tabletop. I feel like when you pair that with being pretty strong as well, I can see where a bit of bad feeling might emerge. The Custodes perhaps have a bit of a reputation being kind of easy to play with, stomp your Golden Boys towards the central objectives, and laugh off damage with their great saves, then have some pretty powerful melee. It's not just going to win you games at the top level or anything like that. They're not the strongest faction in 40k right now, but it can potentially make them a real challenge to play for people playing at a more casual level. Just lots of raw power that you can't go too far wrong with. I kind of feel like there again might be an army that could be considered a skew list as well. Just about every model in the force will usually have toughness 5, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul at base. Again, it can be a bit of a damage check as to whether or not your guns can really overcome that or not. Finally, as with a few of the other armies in this list, their unit pool is just a little bit on the smaller side, particularly if you're sticking primarily to the Games Workshop plastics as opposed to all the fancy Forge World things. There maybe does tend to be a bit of convergence in army lists as well. Infantry and bites tend to feature very heavily, maybe with a little bit of Forge World support. In general though, I feel like this might be a bit more of a temporary case for the Adeptus Custodes. If they were a bit more mid-tier and a bit less prevalent in the meta, I feel like people would probably not care whatsoever. There's plenty of chunky elite armies out there. Maybe in a similar sort of vein to that, in 4th place here we have the Dark Angels. They were rated 2.8 out of 5 by you guys, 4th least popular army to play against at the moment. Again, I feel like the Dark Angels might be going down the fairly popular and fairly strong type route. They are basically one of the very strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now, around about a 58% tournament win percentage, kind of similar to the Genestealer cult, though it seems that they've just escaped being in this ranking. For the Dark Angels, again I do think that it's very much a reflection of their current rules and power right now. Historically they aren't exactly an unpopular army to play against, and certainly when they get rare, people are generally all over to play them, and see some Deathwing and Ravenwing on the table. The other Space Marine sub-factions are ranked far higher. Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars and Deathwatch all of kind of a similar level far out of these rankings, so I think it is just their rules being a bit oppressive that people don't like. On the list I didn't have Iron Hands separately, but I feel like if I did they probably would have been down at this kind of level, basically feeling like Space Marines but +1 and bringing some very nasty tools to the table. In terms of their army power, I think it's the same old story that Deathwing are just ridiculously tanky. Very durable now with the Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminators, as well as being very dangerous in melee as well. Certainly for people who play full Deathwing Terminator armies, they can be a bit of a slog to chew through. Permanent transhuman physiology, great saves and high number of wounds, and really quite easy to get objectives secured, either if you go full Deathwing or just with Rites of War. The Ravenwing and Arcs of Omen are pretty much an equal threat though, ridiculously fast movement, all-game Devastator Doctrine, and lots of tricks to allow them to hit first or run away, and then pair that all with a bit of powerful support. Their regular characters are great, including their psychic powers. I feel like in terms of feel-bad units to play, the Talon Master might not be the best. In general, I feel like whenever you've got a massive dangerous gun platform that your opponent literally cannot shoot despite it being in full view, that's very rarely going to be a moment where they feel particularly good about it. It might be a similar sort of thing with the Desolation squads if they become popular and used quite a bit. Dark Angels make some very good use of those ignores line of sight shooting Space Marines as well. Overall, my take would be that there's probably nothing intrinsically making Dark Angels unpopular, just being very strong at the moment with the rules that they have in 9th edition, a lot of which I'm sure will go away in 10th. Voted third least popular out of the list here, and here we have the Tau Empire. These were voted 2.7 out of 5 by you guys, and I must admit I feel like in this kind of poll they're an army that I'm not too surprised to see a little bit lower down. Tau definitely aren't particularly oppressive at the moment, kind of fairly balanced with around about 49% wins, pretty mid-tier within Warhammer 40k, neither excessively powerful nor excessively weak. I feel like Tau are maybe a faction that are carrying just quite a bit of baggage around with them, being well known to be the ranged army in Warhammer 40k, where just about every other army has at least some melee that they tend to go in with. When your entire faction is just focused on just one thing in the shooting phase, it can make them a little bit less interactive to play with other phases, and certainly in missions before things like 8th and 9th edition, they wouldn't have all that much incentive to do anything but sit back and shoot for a good few turns, clear away most of your army ideally and try and avoid combat, and then move up to grab objectives late game. Admittedly, currently in 9th edition, I'd say that's far less true than it generally has been through much of Warhammer 40k's history. The 9th edition missions force you to move up and try and take the midfield objectives fairly early in the game, so you can't just sit back and shoot. Plus, games tend to be played with a lot more line of sight blocking terrain on them now, meaning that the balance between melee and shooting armies tends to be a lot better. Still though, for a lot of factions, I feel like they don't enjoy playing against pure ranged armies and just missing out on the trading units that the combat phase can often bring. Beyond that, I'd say that Tau maybe currently and historically have had a fair few feels bad units and options, and maybe that doesn't exactly help them get a good rep. You can still use command points to do a big move shoot move with a big battlesuit block, potentially keeping them safe from firepower while still doling out your own. I guess it's not quite as big a deal though when the entire army could jump shoot jump with jetpacks in previous editions. They also do have minus 2-inch to charge stratagems on a couple of their units, plus massively dangerous commanders with character protection, again a unit that can delete a whole chunk of the enemy army and not get shot back provided you've got something to screen it with. With their good movement they also can be pretty frustrating to play against. In general though, they have had an awful lot of annoying mechanics in the past as well. In 8th edition in particular, with their gun drones protecting things like riptides, that meant that you could basically have riptide battlesuits as massive gun turrets that again you couldn't really shoot or anything. And their previous Overwatch was kind of insane as well, being able to lay down fire with other supporting units nearby, meaning that even if you could catch up with them, your unit might get gunned down anyway. Overall, the Tau are definitely a faction with a lot of baggage, still seem to be somewhat unpopular to see on the other side of the table. Though I do feel that perhaps if you're considering the game from the other player's perspective as well, 9th edition missions can be a bit of a struggle for the Tau. They have to push up with some units and put them within charge and strike back range, somewhere that absolutely most of them don't really want to be, and managing that kind of risk can be pretty tricky. Next up, I'm voted second least popular army to play in Warhammer 40k right now, and here we have the Leagues of Votann, 40k's new space dwarves. Looks like you guys rated these at just 2.6 out of 5. It does seem like the new kids on the block aren't particularly favoured foes. Admittedly, their codex when it first came out looked absolutely wild, though since then Games Workshop has hit them with a couple of really quite powerful nerfs. They're now a bit more of a mid-tier army, or perhaps an upper mid-tier, around about 51% wins. Solid enough, but definitely not one of the very top factions in the game. I feel like perhaps the general narrative for Leagues of Votann and why they're not quite so popular is that they just tend to ignore quite a lot of enemy army mechanics. Obviously judgment tokens are the big one, and they can be kind of nasty when you get those all over one of the best units in your army. It means it's going to go down in short order. It's perhaps not so bad against armies that have a whole ton of expendable units to throw at the enemy, but for some ones that rely on some really big strong tanky things like perhaps Knights or Custodes, a matchup against Leagues of Votann can be pretty bad news. Otherwise, they do also have a few other options that tend to cancel out other rules in enemy armies. Void Armor just turns off rerolls, like some lieutenant character buffs. If you invested in something that rerolls wound rolls, then you might as well not serve against Leagues of Votann. And they do have access to a fair bit of ignores involves rail weapons, still having access to that kind of apocalyptic splash damage option if you take along Uthar the Destined. Otherwise, with a fairly small range, they are going to be one of the armies that just doesn't really have that much unit or list diversity yet. They've only got 11 units in the codex right now. That's not going to lend itself to an enormous amount of varied playstyle. I feel like lore and feel wise, at least a few people might still be a little bit unsure about the new guys. It can just feel a little bit arbitrary when Games Workshop crowbars some factions back into the fluff, even if these guys are kind of a reawakening of the squats, I suppose. It does seem that the Leagues of Votann aren't enormously popular to play right now though, but hopefully a reimagined 10th edition rule set will change that. Finally, and seemingly voted the very least popular faction to play on the other side of the table, at least at the moment, are the Harlequins. It currently seems that on average, people just aren't the biggest fans of seeing the breakdancing clown Eldar on the other side of the table. You guys voted them 2.5 out of 5. Though again, I feel like they might be an army that's perhaps suffering from their reputation over the past year or so. At least prior to the Arcs of Omen updates, they were pretty much the strongest army in the game for a really good long while, despite Games Workshop hitting them with multiple nerfs. Currently, in terms of army power and win percent, they're still kind of fine, around about 49% wins, pretty mid-tier within Warhammer 40k, though certainly not unplayable. Again, with armies like Drukhari, I feel like player expectations lag a bit behind actual data, so a lot of the time that people might have played these guys might have been absolutely being stomped by them without much chance of reprisal, even if their rules might be a bit more tame now. They really were ridiculous when they released, around about a 70% win percent or so. Otherwise though, at least in terms of the theory, I feel like the Harlequins check off two other really quite big boxes on annoying armies to fight. Even among other Eldar, their shenanigans and ridiculous movement are incredibly powerful. Their Starweaver transports zooming around 16 inches and then hitting you with bucket loads of fusion pistols. And they've got some seriously nasty stratagems when they get into combat. They can do some fairly gamey stuff, and they do have a couple of move shoot move abilities, and a bunch more rerolls with luck dice to have another chance at some invuls. Then, even more so than the Leagues of Votann, lists of Harlequins are going to be very samey indeed. Games Workshop never really expanded on the faction all that much at all. They've got a pretty tiny unit pool within the Eldar Codex, and it's going to be rare that a Harlequins list isn't going to go super heavy on troops and Starweavers, maybe with a couple of the other jet bikes in support. I guess it kind of comes with the problems of being a mini faction and not being supported very well by GW. Finally, I would say that in general, if you're playing against a Harlequins player, it often tends to be against a player that knows the army really well inside out. They've got a bit of a reputation for being an army of experienced players more so than new players, perhaps partly because of the model variety and the difficulty painting them, plus attraction to some weird and arcane rules mechanics might just up the chance of the person playing them being able to unload their tricks and combos just very well, compared with people who jump into easier factions to collect. In any case, it does seem that more so than most, people aren't super enthused to play against Harlequin armies, though obviously I bear in mind everything I said before, it's very much the player that really makes the game rather than their army. So anyway, let me know what you think of the way that people voted down in the comments below, and please let me know your insights if you do or don't like playing against each of these factions. It'll be interesting to hear what you guys have to say. I'm sure there's plenty of other stuff that I didn't pick up on here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. Hopefully at some point we'll do the reverse of this one and look at the top of the field. Should be fun to take a look there. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.